Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about Elizabethan skullduggery, just to liven you up after lunch. I'm going to talk about the Elizabethan playwright and poet Christopher Marlowe, which is how I've come into the authorship question, and his connection to the Earl of Essex. I'm going to discuss links to the author Shakespeare, whom Professor Jonathan Bate has argued from his writings was an Essex man. And I'm also going to make some links to the authorship candidates Francis Bacon and Henry Neville. But I am going to talk quite a lot about Marlowe, okay, so deal with that. We do need some context before I get into the Earl of Essex stuff. So the link between the Earl of Essex and Christopher Marlowe centres on Marlowe's secondary career as an intelligence agent, or spying if you want the more exciting term. I try and make him seem more respectable by saying intelligence agent a lot. Before we go yet, I want to discuss briefly the interestingly close timing between the end of Christopher Marlowe on the 30th of May, 1593, and the start of William Shakespeare, the first recorded sale of the first publication to have the name Shakespeare attached, Venus and Adonis, happened less than 2 weeks after Marlowe's apparent demise. Many scholars would argue that there were earlier sightings of Shakespeare, the author. For example, in September 1592, Robert Greene's famous passage about Shakespeare was published. And in the same year, Thomas Nash wrote about brave Talbot, who appears in Henry VI, Part 1. There's also the entry in the Stationer's Register of Venus and Adonis 12 days before Marlowe's apparent death. But the fact is that Greene doesn't mention Shakespeare, and there are good arguments for his target being Edward Alleyn. Nash doesn't mention Shakespeare either, and the play wasn't publicly attributed to Shakespeare for another 31 years. And now, of course, some scholars are arguing that it was co-authored a number of different writers, including Marlowe. And the Stationer's Register entry also doesn't mention Shakespeare. Venus and Adonis was registered anonymously. And I can see that Lisa's lengthening I put this in normal screen and it's been put to widescreen, and that means that some of my cover-ups don't completely work, which is predictable, isn't it? Absolutely predictable. Anyway, forget all that. So Marlowe's sudden and fearful end, as it is described in government papers, happened under suspicious circumstances. Our fantastic guest speaker, Paul Hammer, wrote, though it seems almost universally accepted that the circumstances of Marlowe's demise are suspicious and that the coroner's verdict of accidental killing is dubious. Though Professor Hammer has argued that Marlowe's death resulted from a meeting designed to collect a debt from Marlowe, that doesn't explain why an all-day meeting of some 8 hours was necessary, or why meet in Deptford in the house of Dame Eleanor Bull, a woman with strong court connections, and it certainly doesn't explain the presence of top intelligence agent Robert Poley. Marlowe's work as an intelligence agent remains the most plausible explanation for the specific people, location and timing of the Deptford incident and the inquest's dubious verdict. Since it is his intelligence work that connects Marlowe to Essex, posthumously, interestingly, we should look more closely at that. Going back 6 years to June 1587, when Marlowe was due to receive his master's degree from Cambridge, it was withheld by the university because of rumours that Marlowe had intended to go overseas to the Catholic seminary at Rheims, the source of Jesuit plots to kill the Queen. And this is where the whole religion issue comes in. The Privy Council intervened with a letter that stated their lordships thought good to certify that he had no such intent, but that in all his actions he had behaved himself orderly and discreetly, whereby he had done Her Majesty good service and deserved to be rewarded for his faithful dealing, because it was not Her Majesty's pleasure that anyone employed as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country should be defamed by those that are ignorant in the fare he went about. The letter was signed by the 5 most powerful men in the country, and it's the best evidence we have that Marlowe was working as an agent of the Crown by the end of his time at Cambridge. That he was still working as an intelligence agent several years later is strongly suggested by the circumstances of his arrest in Flushing in the Low Countries in January 1592. A letter from the governor, Robert Sidney, to Lord Burleigh speaks of Marlowe as a professional scholar who has been reported for counterfeiting coin by one Richard Baines. Richard Baines, we now know, was a Catholic double agent. And though Marlowe was sent back to Lord Burleigh, who was by this time running the Secret Service, he was apparently not punished in any way, though counterfeiting was considered a form of treason. Marlowe's biographer, David Riggs, argues that Marlowe was in Flushing as an intelligence agent there to infiltrate the circle of Sir William Stanley, who was plotting against the Queen's life. And it was this intelligence work, we think, that leads Marlowe towards his sticky end the following May. On May the 5th, 1593, a poem in blank verse signed Tamburlaine, one of Marlowe's most famous protagonists, was posted on the wall of the Dutch church in London. This Dutch church libel, as it is known, angered the authorities, and a few days later, the Privy Council met and sanctioned torture to discover its author. On the 12th of May, Marlowe's former roommate, the playwright Thomas Kidd, was arrested and tortured, we think, by Richard Topcliffe. According to state records, Kidd confirmed that papers found in his possession, described as vile, heretical conceits, were Marlowe's. Marlowe was accused in writing by informers of being an atheist and spreading atheist ideas. And the most famous of these documents is the Baines Note, a long list of blasphemies and heresies that Marlowe supposedly said, written down by the same double agent who got him arrested in Flushing. The man who has been described as his nemesis, Richard Baines. On the 18th of May, a warrant was issued for Marlowe's arrest. It stated that he was likely to be found at Scadbury, the home of his friend and patron, Thomas Walsingham, who was the cousin of Sir Francis Walsingham, the influential Privy Councillor who had effectively invented the Secret Service. Powerful forces were at work against Marlowe now, not only from the enemies of the Crown, like Richard Baines, who wanted him out of the way, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, who was on a mission to root out heretics, atheists, and all those who didn't adhere to Church of England doctrine. In a country where the Queen was the head of the Church, Marlowe's heresies were essentially treasonous. And yet, as the Privy Council letter of 6 years earlier avows, he had served his country and his Queen. He had done Her Majesty good service, touching the benefit of his country, and was most likely still in the employment of the intelligence services, now under the control of Lord Burleigh William Cecil. On May the 20th, Marlowe responded to the warrant by appearing at court, and he was released under his own recognizance, being asked to attend their lordships daily. Under these circumstances, what happened 10 days later can be seen as a solution to the position that he and his employers in the intelligence service found him in. The official story is, of course, that at the end of an all-day meeting with 3 men, he was killed in an argument over the bill. But many scholars believe the inquest conducted by the Queen's own coroner, William Danby, was a cover-up. And they believe it was a cover-up for an assassination. But it's also possible it was a cover-up for his escape. And I could do a whole talk on that theory, and I have done, but that's not the subject of this talk. So now that I've covered the context and the background, let's return to this. Let's look at how the suspicious circumstances of the events at Deptford are linked not just to Marlowe and his patron, Thomas Walsingham, represented here by the actor who played him in the HBO series Will, Edward Hayter, because there are no surviving portraits of Thomas Walsingham, and how these events are also linked to the subject of today's conference, the Earl of Essex. The 3 people named in the inquest document as being present at Marlowe's demise are Ingram Fraser, Robert Poley, and Nicholas Skeers. Now, Fraser and Skeers were professional liars. Legal documents show they were con men who worked together to trick young gentlemen out of their fortunes. We already know that Marlowe was an intelligencer, but his patron, Thomas Walsingham, had also been an intelligence agent working for his cousin, Sir Francis. Robert Poley had been the key intelligence agent in unravelling the Babington plot, the plot against Elizabeth I that eventually led to the execution of James VI's mother, Mary Queen of Scots. His cover was blown, Poley's cover was blown as a result of that mission, but he worked high up in the Secret Service as a coordinator. He's described by Charles Nicholl as a section head or chief, and by William Camden, the Tudor chronicler and friend of Ben Jonson, as an expert dissembler. Nicholas Skeers was also a former agent who had worked for Sir Francis Walsingham during the Babington plot era. So let's look at the connections. Fraser and Skeers worked together as conmen. Both of them worked for Thomas Walsingham. Fraser, the supposed murderer, remained in Walsingham's service for the rest of his life and was given various land and leases after James came to the throne. Poley had worked in intelligence with Walsingham and with Skeers. And we also know Walsingham was Marlowe's patron, and his home was where Henry Maunder went to look for him when issued with the arrest warrant. A home that is incidentally a 20-minute gallop from Deptford. Thomas Walsingham was connected to the Earl of Essex by marriage. Essex was married to his cousin Frances Walsingham, the daughter of spymaster Sir Francis. And Nicholas Skeers was also connected to Essex. When brought up before the Star Chamber a month before the Deptford incident, Skeers referred to the Earl of Essex as his lord and master. This was the reason why Charles Nicholl had originally suspected Essex of organising Marlowe's murder. But not only does Essex have no motive for murdering Marlowe, the timing is wrong. Because only 2 months before Skeers' appearance in front of the Star Chamber, Essex had been appointed to the Privy Council. He was trying to build his power base. Being the lord and master of a man who had been brought before the Star Chamber for criminal activity wasn't going to help him. At the time he was appointed, Lord Burleigh was seriously ill. Burleigh was running the intelligence service out of his own pocket, as Sir Francis Walsingham had done prior to his death in 1590. As Paul Hammer has stated, Essex's goal was clearly to take over Burleigh's role as the Queen's chief advisor. This goal necessitated setting up his own intelligence network because knowledge is power, and he needed to be an independent source of information for the Queen to let the Queen know what was really going on among her enemies, particularly on the continent, but also at home. To do this, to set up his own intelligence network, he employed an experienced intelligencer, Anthony Bacon, one of a select number of people to have their occupation recorded as spy in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So Anthony Bacon was, of course, the brother of Francis, later Sir Francis Bacon. And he is the critical connection between Essex and Marlowe. It is probable that the man connecting them is Nicholas Vaunt. Vaunt was a lifelong friend and correspondent of Bacon. Bacon was Vaunt's closest friend, according to the DMB. Like Marlowe, Vaunt was born in Canterbury. Both Marlowe and Vaunt were Parker Scholars, winning scholarships set up by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, to enable them to study at Corpus Christi in Cambridge. They are also, obviously, both involved in intelligence work. If you're familiar at all with how English society works, you'll understand it's all about helping one's own, helping similar people with similar backgrounds. So it's therefore not very surprising that two of Marlowe's most recent biographers have suggested that it was Nicholas Vaunt who recruited Marlowe into the Secret Service. Then, as now, they went to Oxford and Cambridge to get, the clever young men with languages, linguistic ability into the Secret Service. The connecting figure between Marlowe and Essex, Anthony Bacon, is a fascinating figure from the perspective of the Shakespeare authorship question, and relevant to more than one candidate. He spent 12 years abroad sending intelligence to Lord Burleigh. He is known to have met Michel de Montaigne on at least 2 occasions. Montaigne, whose essays until 1603 were published only in French, they're argued to have significantly influenced Shakespeare's ideas, particularly in Hamlet, King Lear, and The Tempest. He also spent 3 years in the court of Henry of Navarre, whose scholarly obsessions appeared to be roundly mocked in Love's Labour's Lost. In February 1592, Anthony Bacon returned to England. He was in rather poor health. He suffered terribly from gout, apparently. He tried to get employment with Lord Burleigh. You'd think after that long service of sending him useful information for 12 years, but no, he was unsuccessful. And his brother Francis introduced him to Essex, and he became Essex's spymaster. And this is where the main connection occurs between Essex and Marlowe. It concerns a letter sent to Anthony Bacon by one Thomas Drury on August the 1st, 1593, exactly 2 months after Marlowe's inquest. The letter discloses Drury's pivotal role in the prosecution of Marlowe, his responsibility for procuring the Baines note, and he also says that he knows the author of the Dutch church libel. Now you see why I had to give you all that background, right? So what else do we know about Drury? Well, he was the probable author of a document called Remembrances Against Richard Cholmondeley. And in this document, he writes that Cholmondeley was one of a damnable crew of atheists. This document also includes accusations against Marlowe. Drury says that Marlowe persuaded Cholmondeley to become an atheist. It also says, Marlowe revealed to Cholmondeley that he hath read the atheist lecture to Sir Walter Raleigh and others. This is the context that lies behind his letter to Anthony Bacon. So let's look at an extract from that letter. Since that time, and he's talking about Marlowe's death, which is, as I said, 2 months earlier. Since that time, there is old hold and shove for to get the book that doth maintain this damnable sect, which book I presume there would be given great sums for, and large promises offered in like manner. But none of those will I trust, but if I may secretly confer with you, I have brought with me a merchant will give you such light as he and I can bring you to the man that doeth know who did write the book, and they to how it was delivered, and also who read the lecture, and where and when, with diverse such other secrets as the state would spend £1,000 to know. Clearly looking for cash. For his secrets, although some of this information is already in government archives, he has already provided it, in essence, to the other side. But now he's offering it to Essex through his spymaster, Anthony Bacon. Okay, so what do we know about the key, these bold statements here? Let's look at these highlighted phrases. The book that doth maintain this damnable sect. I have brought with me a merchant. He and I can bring you to the man that doth know who did write the book, and also who read the lecture, and where and when. We know from the Remembrances document that Drury knows it was Marlowe who had read the atheist lecture to Sir Walter Raleigh and others. But what about this book that doth maintain this damnable sect? Who wrote that? Well, as far as we can tell, that was also Marlowe. His friend Thomas Nash, defending him, so some dull-brained maligners of his accuse him of that atheist treatise, De Tribus Impostoribus Mundi. So that's the atheist book that they're talking about. Of course, Thomas Nash is going to defend him, from having written such a thing. But there are other accounts. So William Vaunt says, not inferior to these was one Christopher Marlowe, by profession a playmaker, who, as it is reported, wrote a book against the Trinity. So this is a few years later, and it's widely known that he wrote a book against the Trinity. Henry Oxenden, much later, but he's actually looking back on some remembrances from earlier. He's talking about Simon Aldrich, what his friend Simon Aldrich has told him that he learnt from Thomas Finno, who was born in Canterbury and matriculated from Marlowe's College in 1587. Apparently, Thomas Finno told Aldrich that Marlowe made him an atheist, and also that Marlowe was an atheist and wrote a book against the scriptures, how that it was all one man's making, and would have printed it, but it could not suffer to be printed. So it's not surprising that Charles Nichols says Marlowe is universally said to be the author of the book mentioned in Drury's letter. And do read The Reckoning. It's a fantastic book, and he talks extensively about Drury's letter in that. Okay. So Marlowe is the author of both the Atheist Lecture and the Atheist Book, which presumably is the text of the lecture or an expansion of it. So what can Drury possibly mean when 2 months after Marlowe's apparent demise, he writes to Anthony Bacon about a merchant, saying, "This merchant and he, Drury, can bring you to the man that doth know who did write the book, when that person is Marlowe." And what use is that information when Marlowe is apparently dead? We might assume that Anthony Bacon told his employer, the Earl of Essex, of the letter he received, and that Essex might have discussed it with Henry Carey, the Lord Chamberlain, a fellow member of the Privy Council, because a few days later, the Lord Chamberlain had Drury arrested and imprisoned, and after that, Drury simply disappears from the records. What might be the Lord Chamberlain's interest in this offer of posthumous information about Marlowe? Key Marlowean Peter Ferry sees Marlowe's disappearance into exile as a compromise solution worked out between those on the Privy Council arguing for Marlowe to be protected and kept alive as a valuable agent of the Queen's intelligence network, and those keen to see him punished, preferably killed, as an example to other heretics, atheists, and blasphemers. A convincing fake death and permanent exile is the perfect compromise. This is just a theory, of course, but it would explain why it's Puckering's hand, and Puckering was very much an ally of Whitgift, Puckering's hand on the copy of the Baines note that amends the words "sudden and violent death" to the more equivocal "sudden and fearful end of his life" when talking in the past tense about Marlowe. What we do know for certain is that the man who ordered the arrest of Thomas Drury in 1593 set up the following year the theatre company that was to become famous for performing the plays that would subsequently be known as Shakespeare's. In this same year, 1594, William Shakespeare, a merchant, was first recorded as a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men. In this same year, the first plays of the Shakespeare canon are published anonymously. So what would be the Bacon brothers' involvement in all of this? Let's consider a letter sent from Francis Bacon to his brother on the 25th of January, 1595, that says, "I have here an idle pen or two, especially one that was cozened, thinking to have gotten some money this term. I pray send me somewhat else for them to write out, besides your Irish collection, which is almost done." Francis clearly employs a small coterie of scribes to write things out in fair copy. Could it be one of them who is responsible for the penwork on that strange document of such interest to authorship doubters, known as the Northumberland Manuscript? On this document, dated 1596-7, before a single play had been published under William Shakespeare's name, William Shakespeare is scribbled repeatedly, as if for practice. It includes, among its many scribbles, the words "by Mr. Francis Bacon" and the name of his brother Anthony. It also mentions the name Neville prominently and the motto of Henry Neville's family. It also mentions Richard II and Richard III, yet to be published, and the shortened form of an obscure word from Love's Labour's Lost. And it mentions Marlowe's friend Thomas Nash, and his play, The Isle of Dogs. This is all on one sheet for those of you not familiar with the Northumberland Manuscript. It's just the cover sheet, presumably for what was once inside, but it has been used for writing practice, no question about it. So could this document have been produced by the idle pens Francis writes to Anthony about? If Francis Bacon was producing the fair copy service that caused Hemmings and Condell to remark upon the unusually blotless manuscripts they received of the Shakespeare plays, would it be any wonder that it was also Bacon that sent a letter to the new king, King James, as he came to the throne in 1603, that closed in words no orthodox scholar can explain, so desiring you to be good to concealed poets? And we should note that in Barry Clark's recent peer-reviewed academic book, Francis Bacon's involvement in several plays in the clearly much edited first folio has been detected. Bacon's involvement in copying out plays potentially passed to him by his spymaster brother is speculative, of course, but I want to leave you with one final speculation which links us back to Marlowe. And that is the mention on the Northumberland manuscript of Marlowe's friend Thomas Nash and his lost play, The Isle of Dogs. Nash can, by several pieces of textual evidence, including his own testimony, be counted a close friend of Marlowe's. His play, The Isle of Dogs, was banned and all copies of it destroyed. He had to go on the run to avoid being imprisoned and punished by the authorities. Apparently, the Isle of Dogs infuriated members of the Privy Council, and we can only speculate as to why. All I will observe is this. This is Deptford Strand, just here on the left. That purple bit there that talks about the royal docks is approximately where Mrs. Bull's house would be. This is where he met his sudden and fearful end under dubious circumstances connected to his work in the intelligence services, in a house described by Charles Nicholl as a government safe house and a stopping off point for agents travelling in and out of the country. And that right there in the middle of the curve of the Thames is the Isle of Dogs. Thank you.